I think in real life, in New York, and I'm sure in the streets of any great metropolis, you can meet every day people who have quite successfully done that. You know, who have come here, or New York, or Los Angeles, or London, from wherever, you know, and have made new lives themselves. And very often that involves changing or simplifying a name, you know, etc. In a novel, it's not going to happen. I mean, if I tell you that here are these people, they've arrived from somewhere that they don't want to tell you where they came from, and they don't want to tell you anything about it, and they're clearly concealing something pretty big and pretty dark, it would be very strange not to tell you what that was. Just let the novel end without that coming out. Oh, well, they put that behind them now, and they're fine. that wouldn't work. So I fully intended for the past to blow up in their face.
Yeah.
And it does.
Thank you so much, and what a wonderful crowd tonight. Walking in with Salman Rushdie was like walking in with a Kardashian. There were all these phones going off. Salman Rushdie is, of course, the author of 13 novels and 4 works of nonfiction. His books have been translated into more than 40 languages and have won pretty much every literary prize there is. In fact, if I were to list them all the prizes and all the awards and honors that have been bestowed upon him, we would be here all evening. But let me just name a couple. His novel, Midnight's Children, won the Booker Prize in 1981 and was also named the best of the Booker by a public vote. The book was also made into a film in 2012, and it was directed by the magnificent Deepa Mehta. Can we give a clap for the homegirl? Salman Rushdie has served as the chairman of the Penn World Voices International Literary Festival. He's received a British knighthood. He's been inducted in France's L'Ordre des Arts et des Lettres. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and he's written a song with U2 and Bono. Salman Rushdie's newest novel is The Golden House. It is terrific, big and rich and mysterious and gripping. It's been billed as Rushdie's return to realism, but given that this is a Salman Rushdie book, there are still references to Greek tragedy and Roman history, alongside some very current events, namely the presidency of Barack Obama and the election of Donald Trump. And in between, observations about art and identity, guns, gender, race, immigration, love and sex, and politics and superheroes. There is a lot to dig into in this new novel, so let's get to it. Please help me welcome Salman Rushdie.
Kardashian, really? Okay.
There were a lot of cell phones going off, cell phone cameras going off,
okay.
And there was a lot of applause.
All right.
So. And I should say that there will be a short Q&A at the end. There is a microphone there in the center, so as we're winding up, I'll let you know, and if you have a question, you can make your way to the mic. Now, for those who haven't read The Golden House, I don't want to give too much away, but I want to give a quick setup.
Yeah.
A real estate tycoon named Nero Golden immigrates to New York under mysterious circumstances and settles into a mansion in Greenwich Village with his 3 sons, all of them using new identities and names. They attract the curiosity of a neighbor, an aspiring filmmaker named Renee. He gets drawn into their circle and becomes the narrator of their story. The book opens on the day of the inauguration of Barack Obama, and it closes with the election of Donald Trump, a character who's referred to as the Joker in the book. So I wanted to ask about the timing. When did you start working on the book, and what was the sort of the germ of idea you had when you started?
It's one of the books, unusually for me, that came almost immediately after delivering the previous one. And when I finished 2 years, 8 months, 28 nights, what was that, 2.5 years ago?
Yeah.
Almost at once, I had thought to write a very different kind of New York novel. I mean, that's a New York novel too, but it's kind of a fairy tale. It has genies and flying urns, things like that, and genies riding flying urns. And I thought maybe next time hold the genies, And I thought, I really thought I'd like to write a social panoramic novel, and I started reading myself in by reading very great novels of that kind, like James Baldwin's Another Country, which is actually set in Greenwich Village in very much the same neighborhood, and you know, Edith Wharton's Age of Innocence and Henry James's Washington Square, and you know, books like that. And Stendhal, you know, I actually looked at Scarlet and Black, and because my novel has tormented brothers, I thought I better look at Karamazov. And so I did, and it really wasn't very useful. I mean, great novel, but it's just so unlike what I was trying to do that in the end it wasn't as helpful as some of these others. So I sort of read myself into it and thought a lot about Dickens, because one of the things that I love about the writing of Charles Dickens is that you have this background, this sort of milieu, which is unbelievably detailed in its kind of hyper-realism. You know, I mean, every detail of it is accurate and obsessively, you know, accurate. And then against that world, that background, he projects these characters who are kind of larger than life, who are sort of magnified. And the reason we believe the characters, the reason we buy them is because they are so deeply rooted in the real, you know, that they feel real. And I thought kind of do that.
Yeah.
I thought, you know, there's young René, the filmmaker who's the narrator, who is not always a modest person, is rather grand sometimes when he talks about the kind of films he's only making little videos, you know, but he's already planning to be an auteur of the scale of Kieslowski, you know. He has his own decalogue in his head that he's going to make 10 films, you know, etc. So, but he refers to the style that he wants to use as what he calls operatic realism. And I thought that's kind of not a bad description for what I was trying to do too, which is to use some of that, the larger than life scale of opera, you know, but apply it to really the real world. And I mean, and the thing is that some of the story I've had in my head for 10 years. You know, the actual story of Nero Golden, really I've had really since the 2008 attacks in Bombay. You know, because that's where they come from. Nero Golden, not his real name. And the fact that he calls himself that tells you something about what he thinks of himself. But he comes from Bombay, and he and his 3 sons leave in the immediate aftermath of that attack, in which his wife, their mother, is killed, you know, at the Taj Hotel. And one of the starting points of the book was, I thought, first of all, there's a very interesting connection in Bombay between very, very wealthy people on the one hand and the crime mafias on the other, you know, that you kind of see them at the same parties. Because the gang bosses have paid off the police and all that, so they don't have to worry about anything trivial like being arrested. You know, so, and the movies, you know, there's a lot of mob money in the movies in the way that there was in Hollywood in the 40s. So there's that connection. And then one of the things that became clear after the attacks was that there was also a connection between the mafia and the jihadist terrorists coming from Pakistan. They had sort of worked together. So I thought if I could put somebody in the middle of that, that would be an interesting story. And so Nero was kind of born in that way. It's somebody who gets involved in shady stuff and wants to get away from it, wants to escape it for his own sake and for the sake of his children. And goes through this incredibly elaborate scheme to cross the world and become different people. And it doesn't work because, you know, I'm writing the novel and I'm not going. Why would you let it work? What kind of book would that be?
All the drama's gone, all the mystery.
Yeah, people run away, the end.
Yeah.
So,
so did New York, because the idea of, there's a couple of threads I want to pick up there, because this is such a great New York novel, sort of in the lineage of the books you talked about, and also like Gatsby, Bonfire of the Vanities. The two ideas came together. You see, I mean, I was on one bit of my head, I was thinking about this social novel of New York, and then I had this story, and I realized that, you know, if you're going to go somewhere to reinvent yourself, it probably would
might as well be New York City
Yeah.
because that's such a well-known trope
Yeah.
of the New York novel. So they sort of clicked together, those ideas. And then I had this frightening idea of writing really right up against the present moment. You know, I mean, writing about the moment in which the book was being written, you know, and you're not supposed to do that. You know, you're supposed to have distance and perspective and all that. I'm not good at doing what I'm supposed to do. So I thought, do this dangerous thing, and if you do it wrong, then the book almost immediately becomes worthless, like kind of yesterday's papers, you know. And if you do it right, then if you're lucky, you can capture a moment, you know, for all time. And that's the only sense in which I think the Gatsby comparison is really relevant, because I think Fitzgerald was wonderful at that, you know, and he was writing right up against the present day. And actually many people criticized his writing, including Gatsby, when it came out, for saying it was just like gossip, you know, and boy, were they wrong, you know. But I thought, you know, now if we look back at the so-called jazz age, it's very hard not to see it partly through Scott Fitzgerald's eyes, you know. And so I thought, if you do it right, that's what happens. You know, what happens is that contemporary readers, when they read the book, can have the pleasure of recognition. You know, they say, oh yeah, this is how it is, you know. And down the road in the future, people reading it can think this is how it was, and it feels truthful, you know. So that was sort of the aim. There's a line somewhere, I can't remember which of the Hemingway bullfighting texts, you know, where he says that the great bullfighters work closest to the bull. You know, that if the bull's over there, it's not so dangerous. But if the bull is like brushing your thigh as it turns, then you know, it's dangerous. You could get gored. And that working that close to the present moment felt like that. Felt very dangerous, but kind of exciting. You know, kind of exciting. So, yeah. That's what happened.
Well, and I wanted to ask, you know, getting back to this idea about sort of, you know, writing about the place you're in the moment you're in. And when I think that there's a line in the book that talks about certain cities, like London, Rome, and Paris, that stand somewhat separate from the rest of their nation, as does New York. And one of the characters actually says, this is not the United States of America, this is New York. So in terms of writing a New York novel, how much are you fighting against people's ideas about the New York that already exists in so many people's mind? Does that help you as a writer, or is that something you have to fight against?
No, it's just all part of what there is, you know, and you just use it if you want to and don't if you don't, you know. I mean, it's true that I think that between the great metropolis and the rest of the country, there's always a kind of difference. There's a, you know, Bombay is not India. New York is not America, Paris is not France. And in some way there's a kind of distrust. You know, I mean, the United States, people really distrust New York. You know, one of the great insults being thrown in the general election campaign at the Democrats was that they suffered from New York values. You know, which of course in New York you think are the only values worth having. And one of the strange things about the New Yorker who became president is that he is the antithesis of New York values. You know? He's the least New York person there could possibly be.
Although I think that, I mean, so many people have commented on the fact that Trump's outsider status, the sense of being the boy from the boroughs who saw the glittering lights of Manhattan, had a great deal to do in shaping him. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, that and his father going to Ku Klux Klan meetings.
Fair.
That was shaping, you know. The image of the apple and the tree not falling very far.
You've lived in New York since 2000.
Yeah.
So you've been there through this quite a remarkable stretch of time. You were there
Yeah.
through 9/11, its aftermath, the financial crisis, the growing concentration of wealth within Manhattan, the gentrification that's sort of pushing people
Yeah.
off of Manhattan out into the boroughs. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how the city has changed in your time there, how you feel about it from what it is now to you and what it was when you arrived.
You know, I remember when I first arrived in New York, which was, before 9/11, there was a cartoon in the New Yorker, which was just the famous skyline, and a big sign hanging off the Empire State Building, which said "full." and it was true that it felt like it was very hard to get in, if you didn't have substantial quantities of money. And that didn't used to be the case, because when I first got to know New York, I was very young. I was like 25 or something when I first went there in the 70s, and this was that very different New York, that was dirty and broke.
Yeah, this was the sort of the New York of the, go to hell. Ford says, go to hell, New York. The idea that the city was collapsing.
Yes,
it was in
yes.
debt. The
Yes.
federal government was not going to bail it out.
Yes, all of that. And, the rats lived better than the people, really. But as well as all that, and partly because of all that, it was very cheap. And as a result, downtown New York, where now you need tens of millions of dollars to own a building, was full of young people and young creative people. So it was, when I first went there were all these little art galleries with artists and filmmakers and writers and poets and musicians and filmmakers, etc. I thought, how much fun is this? And of course, this was also the time of the so-called New York Underground. This was a time of Andy Warhol and the Velvet Underground and CBGBs and Max's Kansas City and all of that. Enormously exciting place to be. And I just thought, one day I want to just come and put myself here and see what happens. And then, then life intervenes and you don't do that. And then I got older and the city changed and then I was 50, and I just thought, if I'm ever going to do this, I better do it. And so I did it. And of course it's a different New York, but it's still New York City, I mean, it's still, there's a New Yorkness about New York that hasn't gone away.
Yeah. And do you feel like there still is that creative pulse? There is the sense
it's just spread, because the Village is so expensive, Soho is so expensive. It first, of course, spread to Brooklyn, and then Brooklyn became too expensive, and now even Queens, even Trumpistan is beginning to be a place where young people go.
Yeah. I wanted to get back to the point about Trump being in
Whose
New York.
name, by the way, I just have to say, his name does not appear in the novel.
No. You give him a different name. Well, you
I
give the
give somebody,
character.
Yeah. It's what we call fiction.
Yeah.
What we in the trade call fiction.
I had read when I was researching this, preparing for this interview, that you had said, New Yorkers knew what Trump was about, and now the country knows what he was about. And there were stories about his greed as a developer, the kind of splashy kind of the kind of vulgar presence he had throughout the 80s and 90s,
and the fact that it was all leveraged, it was all borrowed money, it was all debt.
Yeah.
And that he didn't pay the people who worked for him. Kind of contractors got stiffed right, left, and center.
Yeah. And the way in which, too, he also stirred up a great deal of racial hostility in the city. He didn't, his buildings wouldn't rent to black tenants.
Yeah.
He took that enormous ad in the newspaper with this against the Central Park Five.
Yes, but against with the whole jogger case, and he was just wrong.
Yes. What does he mean for New York now? What
people hate him. That's what it means. I mean, look, 90% of New York voted against Trump. 90%. That's an enormous figure. In any election, to have a 90-10 split is normally you have to fix the election to do that.
Yes.
But in New York, we just did it for love. His children go to restaurants and people boo. He doesn't show up very often because he knows,
Yeah.
I mean, he's been there the last 2 days because of the United Nations
Yeah.
General Assembly, and everybody is just saying, why doesn't he just go?
Yeah.
You know? So, he's not very well liked.
Do you have any thoughts on the speech that he gave? Did you see it?
Yeah, of course. I've got the same thoughts as you have. It's and I have to say that one of the things about being in Canada at the moment is one has to constantly fight one's feelings of envy. Because, you've got a sane government, and we've got him.
Yeah.
So it's bad. It's
Yeah.
bad. Yeah. I saw a map, sort of a fake map on the internet, which proposed a greater Canada, which would extend down the west and east coast of the United States. This kind of like that, this big horseshoe. And I thought, that's I belong to that.
We'll take you.
Yeah, I mean,
we'll
listen.
take you, I think.
There's millions of us that you might have to take.
I don't know if you saw it. Ta-Nehisi Coates has a piece in the current issue of The Atlantic called "The First White President," and he writes that that Trump's predecessors made their way to high office through, quote, the passive power of whiteness, while for Trump, quote, whiteness is neither notional nor symbolic, but is the very core of his power. He argues that Trump was elected as a negation of Obama's blackness and a way to reclaim America as a white country. What do you make of that take? Do you think that would
I think that's absolutely right. What happened was that when Obama was elected, many people, including me, thought that it might usher in a more progressive period, in which, for example, on the race issue, there might be some progress, et cetera. And instead, it's as if the force that was really energized was white supremacism. The people who really could not stand it, that for 8 years they had to look at a black family in the White House. This was in part, I mean, it's not only that, but I think the race subject is very big in this election, and so is misogyny. It just seems very strange that, given how many countries in the world have now had women leaders, that the United States still seems to find it difficult to think about that.
Yeah.
And so you put those two things together and you've got a lot of it, But you have to agree that Hillary wasn't the greatest candidate and the Democrats ran an absolutely awful campaign, and so it's like a perfect storm. And then there's the fact, which actually Renee in the novel keeps coming back to, of the enormous abstention.
Yeah.
60 million people voted for Trump. That's 90 million people did not vote. If you have an abstention of 46.7% of the electorate, that makes this kind of thing possible.
Yeah.
And shocking. I mean, really shocking, that figure. And basically what happened is that the Obama coalition fell apart. I mean, the Obama coalition wins elections because it's, young people, women, minorities, and educated white people, university-educated white people. You put that together, it's a majority, and Obama did that twice, and Hillary couldn't hold it. The Hispanic community didn't come out to vote, young people, I think in part because of being alienated by the Bernie factor, didn't come out to vote, and shocking numbers of women voted for Trump.
Yes.
I mean, white women.
Yes.
Black women, 97%, against Trump. White women, a majority of white women voted for Trump.
Yeah.
And in spite of all that stuff, all that stuff, and which now one can use the word pussy because it's presidential.
And when you think about that number of people that don't show up to vote, what kind of, do you think that was its own kind of statement, or does that speak to?
No, it's always like that. And it's not. It wasn't particularly a larger abstention than usual, but there's certain very particular categories that had helped to elect Barack Obama. stayed at home, and that, I think, made a big difference. So
Yeah.
anyway, it's over now. Got to win the next one.
In the novel, and you mentioned it when you were talking about the way in which it came together. One of the questions that the novel wrestles with is the idea of whether a person can escape their past, whether a person can move on, and of course many people come to America to do that. It becomes the place that feels like, for each individual, a bit of a blank slate. The Golden family are described as wanting to escape from the historical into the personal. And I think that, and again, in the book, that this question comes up of, America's history as the America that we know, not the history of the place itself, is young compared to so many other nations. And the country seems to be wrestling so much now with how to grapple with that history. With Trump's campaign to make America great again, there is this selective nostalgia. At the same time, there are activists toppling down statues dedicated to Confederate generals. Has America been too focused on the personal and not enough about its own historical? I mean, is that one of its
I think certainly
mistakes?
there are, America is founded on two enormous crimes. One is the extermination of the original inhabitants, and the other is slavery. And those are the origin stories of America. And of course, people don't look at that very much. In the way that the British tend to ignore imperialism. I had two sons who went through the British educational system without having one lesson about the British Empire.
That's shocking.
Not a single
lesson.
lesson.
That is shocking.
Yeah. The most important single fact about the history of the United Kingdom is the fact that it used to rule a quarter of the world. Not one lesson in expensive private schools, let alone state sector. So there is a thing that countries do about bits of their past that they're not proud of. Which is they start trying to pretend they didn't happen. Yeah. And then they bubble up, and that's what's happening in America right now. The question of whether people can reinvent themselves in that way, which is a kind of American dream. You go to New York, and if you can make it there, you can make it anywhere, as the song tells us. I think in real life, in New York, and I'm sure in the streets of any great metropolis, you can meet every day people who have quite successfully done that, who have come here, or New York, or Los Angeles, or London, from wherever, and have made new lives themselves. And very often that involves changing or simplifying a name, etc. In a novel, it's not going to happen. If I tell you that here are these people, they've arrived from somewhere that they don't want to tell you where they came from, and they don't want to tell you anything about it, and they're clearly concealing something pretty big and pretty dark. It would be very strange not to tell you what that was. Just let the novel end without that coming out. Oh, well, they've put that behind them now, and they're fine. That wouldn't work. So I fully intended for the past to blow up in their face. Yeah. And it does. I mean,
well, and it's
my first gangster novel, I have to say.
Yeah. well, it's interesting because there is that tension between Nero Golden wanting to, imagining America being a place where he can remake a life for himself and his family, but also I think there's a bit of dismissiveness in him towards America being somewhat naive, and America, there's a line that your country is so young, one thinks differently when one has millennia behind one. You have not even 250 years. So he seems both kind of delighted with this idea.
He thinks, he has imperial fantasies.
Yeah.
But the thing I think about Nero is that, when you first meet him in the novel, Renee describes him in a way, it's quite frightening. So he says that he's their new neighbor, and children recoil from his touch. He tries to be friendly, pats people's dogs, and the dogs withdraw. And so I think when you first meet him, you have this impression of him as scary,
As menacing,
and
yeah.
menacing, etc. But I think as the book unfolds and the kind of tragedy of the family takes place, I think you begin to have a lot more compassion for him. You know, and I think by the time you get towards the end of the book, you're much fonder of him. You know, I mean, he's still kind of a bastard, but he's a bit more of a lovable bastard.
Yeah.
You know, by the end of it. So, and I sort of wanted that to happen because one of the questions the book asks more than once is this question about whether good and evil can coexist in the same person.
Yeah.
You know, whether, and I mean, I think the answer is sort of obviously yes, because we're all, you know, because nobody's perfect. We all have things that we do that we regret or are ashamed of, etc., and other things that we do that maybe we're proud of. You know, and but it was when you magnify that, when the scale of the evil becomes larger, then what compensates for that?
Yeah.
You know, and if anything, I mean, for instance, you know, people say that Hitler was kind to animals, and you know, I don't care. It doesn't balance anything. So the question is, when the bad side of a person is really quite front and center, you know, what can be done to show that there's another side that's worth taking note of, that's worth paying attention to? So that, in a way, that really is the birth of the novel, was really this character with this deep flaw, you know, who I was actually quite fond of, you know, in spite of, and being quite clear about the flaws, you know. And that seemed to me like an interesting thing to write about.
Do you find that you need to be fond of your characters?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think literature is best when written out of love, you know, and I think sometimes when you have books in which you feel that the author doesn't feel that towards his characters, it creates a kind of coldness in the text, which can be a problem. I mean, I think, you know, I mean, to be frank, I think it's something that happened to V.S. Naipaul. I think that the early work of Naipaul, up to and including the great masterpiece of Mr. Biswas, you know, is written out of that kind of love. And Mr. Biswas is more or less about his father, so, you know, not surprisingly, it has that kind of affection. But as he goes on from that, that quality seems to go. You know, so when you get to, I mean, another really great novel, which is The Bend in the River, lacks that.
Yeah.
You know, it's very cold towards its characters. And that's, for me, I mean, I wish that hadn't happened. I mean, I can admire A Bend in the River, but I can love House for Mr. Biswas, you know, and I mean, I think that's the difference.
Yeah.
So I think, you know, yes, if you care about your characters, then your readers will, you know, or at least there's a chance that they will.
I wanted to get at one of the other themes and ideas, because again, because this book is written in the moment, it's you are tackling and chewing on these current struggles that we're having, and one of the characters in the book talks about the bubbles that we inhabit, and you'd mentioned earlier the idea that there's New York and there's the the rest of America, so there's, you know, right and left, there's the, you know, the coastal elites and the Midwest. But the book is also concerned with the idea that, you know, even within those bubbles, that they're divided into their own sorts of tribes, and that we end up only talking to people that are like us and yelling at others who are different from us. And I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about why you wanted to write about that.
Renee's parents, who are college professors and I think kind of enjoyable characters.
They are.
But they,
They're very.
They kind of finish each other's sentences.
Yeah.
They've sort of been in love all their lives, and they're very. Anyway, they talk about, and they point out that it's all very well to talk about New York being in a bubble, but actually the whole of New York isn't in the bubble. You know, I mean, Manhattan probably in the bubble, Brooklyn, some parts of it. Queens, absolutely not. You know, Bronx, Staten Island, definitely not in the bubble. So the bubble has like a sub-bubble. But then they argue that why should it be that that's the bubble? Why is it not that people who deny climate change, who fly the Confederate flag, who hate gay people, why is that not the bubble? You know, those are the people who deny the modern world, you know, and who, in a way, have this nostalgia about an imagined past.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I really would like to ask, when was America great?
Yeah, that's
What is the date we're aiming at? When America was great?
Yeah.
It would have to be before the 1960s, because then there was all this awful stuff like sex and drugs and rock and roll. So maybe the 1950s, when nobody was allowed to do anything.
Right.
Or
And
maybe
there was
before women had the vote. Maybe when there was Jim Crow. Yeah, I mean, which date are we aiming at?
Yeah.
You know, and that would be useful to put on those hats made in China, which suggests that America should be made great again. That you want to bracket saying like in, you know, 1870, whatever.
Yeah.
Before Lincoln got in the way.
The other one of the other ideas, which is, you know, it's been throughout your work, but this question of the fracturing of identity and the mutability of identity, and whether it's in the Goldens family ability to leave one place and come to another, to change their names. Again, there's another character who enters it who's from Russia, and she has also changed her background and reinvented herself. And so much of your work has dealt with questions of identity, religious or national, and this one, to a great degree, deals with gender identity, which again feels very of the moment. I mean, we are at a moment of talking about, you know, bathroom bills, and just recently Trump's threat to ban trans troops from the military. And the book also notes that trans identity is not a new one. It talks about the fact that, you know, through, you know, thousands and thousands of years, you can look in, you know, India, Japan, indigenous cultures. What led you to want to explore this question of the mutability of gender identity, or to look at trans identity through a specific
Well, just the
character
big subject of identity is right at the center of this book.
Yeah.
You know, because it's about people trying to change their identity. You know, and so obviously that's the big theme, but then it occurred to me that this is, you know, this word has now acquired so many resonances that it needs to be unpacked a little bit, you know. And one of the things I'm most happy about in the novel is the invention of this place called the Museum of Identity.
So good.
You know,
I wish there was a real museum of identity.
You know, several journalists who've come to talk to me about this book said that they had to Google it to make sure it didn't really exist. And my view is it will exist in like 5 minutes. But anyway, it doesn't exist. But it becomes a location to talk about all the different manifestations of the subject. And I mean, I think it means different things in different places. You know, I think right now it's certainly true that in the United States, if you raise the subject of identity, then you're mostly talking about either gender or race. You know, and those are the kind of hot topics. And you know, in India, if you talk about identity, you're talking more about religion. You know, you're talking more about religious sectarianism. You know, and Indianness and authenticity defined as whether you belong to this or that religious persuasion or background. In England, identity has become again a kind of nostalgic thing. You know, a kind of, which is where the whole Brexit thing comes from. Again, this sort of longing for an imagined England, when everybody wore straw boaters and kind of, you know, moved around in punts. and there weren't any horrible foreigners around, you know. And of course, this is all completely spurious, and as spurious as Trump's imagined America, you know. And I mean, the Indian novelist, now politician, Shashi Tharoor, was in England recently, and he made a very sharp point, I thought. He said that when the British came to India, it was just about the richest country in the world. When the British left India, it was one of the poorest countries in the world. where'd all the money go? You know, and where did all that wealth go? Basically, it went in order to create that imagined England of people in punts and straw boaters. I mean, that's to say, a quarter of the world raped in order to make a kind of dream England possible, and that's why they don't teach it in schools. You know?
Yeah.
So anyway, all of that, you know, whether identity is an imagined past, or is religious, or is to do with race or gender, you know, all of that's become so big that I wanted to dive into it.
Yeah.
You know, and yes, one of the sons of Nero Golden is kind of anguished about his/her gender, and you know, I thought I've got to get into this subject, and I had some starting points, which is that, first of all, you know, if you grow up in Bombay, there's always been quite a large transgender community there, the Hijra community, and I've kind of explored that and written nonfiction about it, you know, in the past, and I always have had it in my head as something very powerful that I felt there was more for me to do than I had done, you know, and then in New York, I know two people, one of whom I know quite closely, who have transitioned, like one in each direction, actually, and both, in my view, very successfully. I mean, in both cases, very much happier people now than before. You know, so I had that experience, which I felt all that gave me like a foothold in the subject, you know, and then I, you know, did some work. I went to find stuff out, you know, and tried to make a serious response to the phenomenon. You know, I mean, the character of D.E. Golden, the youngest son, is less successful than the people that I'm talking about because he's very tormented.
Yes.
You know, and in many ways fails to reconcile the argument inside himself. But because he's tormented, it allows me to present the argument.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It allows me to get into the argument. And you know, I mean, I hope people can see that it's seriously done. You know, and yeah, I mean, it's certainly in New York where it's such a big issue that it seemed quite natural that in a portrait of New York at this moment, that it should be somewhere near the center of the book.
I'm going to ask you one more question and then we'll open it up. So just keep your seats right now, but just prepare yourself, get your questions ready. The last thing I wanted to ask you, just a bit of a diversion. I wanted to ask you about comic books, because I know that you're a lifelong fan of comics, and that's certainly been in your work. You know, with whether it's the inflections of sci-fi and myth and fantasy, but in your last novel, 2 years, 8 months, and 28 nights, there's a graphic novelist in it who invents a superhero based on Shiva. And superheroes play a part in the Golden House as well.
And supervillains.
And supervillains. And so first of all, DC or Marvel? I wanted to ask you what your where your preference lies.
No, it's a very, very good question, and the answer is DC because when I was growing up, Marvel, you know, Marvel came later. It's, you know, Spider-Man is later than Superman and Batman. Yeah. You know, and so I mean, I grew up in Bombay. There was this bookstore at the bottom of the hill where I lived called Reader's Paradise. And
it's a great name for a bookstore.
It's
a great name for a bookstore.
It's in Midnight's Children, actually, but and it's still there. It had this big stack of comics, and I used to go and spend my pocket money on them and hide them under the pillow. Of course, my parents knew perfectly well. So, no, Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Aquaman, Johns, Justice League of America, that stuff, I mean, Michael Chabon's my good friend, and he knows more than me. I've always said that I take the silver medal position because Michael is the world expert on comic books, certainly that I know of. But I know the difference between red kryptonite and green kryptonite.
Oh, okay, so you're a full nerd.
There's a line somewhere in the book where one of the characters says that what's happened in America is that DC, the comics, have taken over DC, you know, Washington. so that you have, you know, here we all are leading, you know, real people in a real place leading our real lives, but you get up to the level of power and it's kind of grotesques and cartoon villains. And That's why the Joker.
Yeah.
Because also, by the way, it just struck me that if in a deck of cards, the two cards that don't behave like the other cards are the Joker and the Trump.
It's perfect.
So I thought, well, I don't want the Trump, so I better have the Joker. You know? And he's very white, you know.
Yes.
His face is very, very white, and his hair is an unusual color.
Yes, yes.
It's green.
It's green, yeah, in the book it's green.
In the book it's green, because the Joker has green hair.
Yeah.
But, you know, and therefore he's nothing at all like another presidential candidate. Because orange, green, not the same thing at all. But it's no, so that's where it came from.
Yeah.
And then I kind of quite liked the idea of having this. It's the only element in the book that is something other than naturalistic or realistic, really. It's just the one little surreal touch in the book.
It feels to me, and especially in this moment right now where there's also, within pop culture, within Hollywood, there's this major resurgence of comic books. And they've always been used to talk about bigger world events. I mean, they've always been sometimes the real life evil is so evil, you need to have a Lex Luthor. Sometimes.
Yeah, well, you know, one of the things that in Michael Chabon's wonderful book, The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, that he shows very clearly is the way in which these superheroes, the Superman, the Batman, you know, emerge at exactly the time of the rise of Nazism.
Yeah.
You know, and initially, because America was not in World War II, they were not allowed to make the Nazis the villains, so they had to invent. The Joker, the Penguin, the Riddler, much, much better villains, you know, and much more kind of immortal villains. But the battle of good and evil that happens in those books is really born out of what was happening in the real world at that time, you know. And remember that almost all the creators of the great comic books were Jews. You know, almost every single one. And so at exactly the moment of the attack on the Jews in Europe, you know, you have Jewish artists in America inventing super Jews to defeat the bad guys. And I mean, Michael's book is wonderful at this, so read that. He does it better than I'm telling you. But yeah, I think that, and now you're right in saying that, you know, so much of popular culture has been eaten by Marvel and DC, you know, that certainly the movies have been. That it's become a way in which we talk about the world. And so that also seemed to be a reason for incorporating a little bit of it in the novel.